The Arctic is a mysterious place that's seen in documentaries and captured in photos, but most will never travel to. The region encompasses the northernmost part of Earth, and throughout history, many fearless explorers have perished sailing on its icy waters and trekking through the desolate terrain. Go back to 1594, and Dutch explorer William Barents was starting the first of what would be 3 expeditions to explore the Arctic region in hopes of finding a northeast passage. If successful, the discovery would shorten the lengthy trip from Europe to Asia that forced sea traders to sail around Africa. While Barents and his crew never found this passage, many returned with stories of the Arctic that still live on today.
They were sailing at that point off of any known map in existence. They didn't know if they were going to try to head north of these, what they thought were probably islands, but they also thought it might be part of a polar continent. At this point, it was thought there might be a giant continent sitting at the top of the planet. And then when they did get stranded, they knew that no one would know where to find them. No one would have any idea where to go or where to look for them or where they might be.
That's Andrea Pitzer, a journalist and the author of Icebound, Shipwrecked at the Edge of the World. She says that what William Barents and his crew were doing back in the late 1500s is the equivalent today of traveling to Mars. There was no concept of what they would find or who would be able to help if they got stranded. Pitzer herself traveled to the Arctic 3 times to better understand the climate and conditions of what the crew endured. She's even planning a 4th trip this August as a sailor working and learning aboard a ship.
First time I went, my big goal was to learn what it would be like in polar night, since they were stuck there over the winter when there's no sunlight at all. Literally, the sun doesn't come up. I wanted to get a feel, at least for a few days, of what that would be like. So I went on a dog sledding expedition on Svalbard, which is halfway between Norway and the North Pole. And a friend of mine here in the States had taught me how to mush, Blair Braverman. She finished the Iditarod her first year trying, which is almost a 1,000-mile race. She had trained me to do the sledding, and I went up, and it was pretty amazing to go away from the coast, away from any lights, when the only lights that were there were if there was light reflecting, a little bit of moonlight maybe off the snow. Other than that, we had to wear headlamps in order to be able to see where we were going and for the dogs to have some sense of where they were going.
This darkness and isolation can take quite a toll. Days without sunlight or seeing a living creature can make a person go mad. For an entire winter on the 3rd expedition, Barents and his crew fought for their lives as they waited for temperatures to rise and their ship to thaw out from the frozen ice.
The ship was still frozen in June, and so they finally gave up on trying to get the ship out of the ice, and they just decided to come home in their small boats. So these are not large boats at all. They burst them up a little bit to make them a little sturdier for the voyage, a little more appropriate for these men to try to come in as a group. But they ended up having to sail more than 1,000 miles in open boats on an open sea before they were able to find another ship that could then take them in. Many of them did eventually get back to Amsterdam.
While much of the crew survived, Barents succumbed to the harshness of the Arctic winter and passed away on the voyage back.
It was pretty incredible because they came into harbor and immediately word spread that they had returned because they had been gone so long at this point. They had set out well over a year before, that it had just been assumed that they were sort of dead and rotten, that they had, vanished from the face of the earth. And then to show up, so many of them alive, was extraordinary.
Pitzer says that today there are structures in place that make it possible to call for help, but it's best to be prepared for any situation because you don't know how long it could take for help to arrive. In 2019, the ship that Pitzer was traveling on broke down and the engine was past the point of repair.
We had to use just sails. We didn't have any motor at all available to us. It wasn't possible to fix it while we were at sea. And so we had to come back only using the power of the wind, which is pretty incredible when the wind is not going in your direction. And that happened to be the case with us several times. So there's a thing you do called tacking into the wind, where you make very little forward progress and you're sort of zigzagging side to side, and the boat is tilted at like a 45-degree angle, and it makes for some wild seafaring. And the Barents Sea itself, which is now named after him, which is that sea between Nova Zembla and Murmansk that we had to cross, The Barents Sea has been known as the devil's dance floor for its choppiness because it has warm water and cool water coming from opposite directions and mixing. So it was quite an adventure to sail that just as Barents would have sailed it. But for me, it really helped me imagine, what it had been like for them back then.
But back then, the Arctic looked much different than what Pitzer saw firsthand. Currently, the ice sheets are melting at an alarming rate, leading to an unsustainable landscape for wildlife and increased global sea levels. According to a combined study out of the UK that was published last month in the Cryosphere, ice melt has ramped up in recent decades. In the 1990s, around 760 billion tons of ice melted per year. 20 years later, more than 1.2 trillion tons are lost in an average year. That's an increase of more than 60%. During Pitzer's third voyage to the Arctic, she traveled to the same islands that Barents and his crew had been stuck on.
The glaciers had retreated so far on the maps of glaciers that we had that it was extraordinary. The maps just were no longer accurate at all. And in fact, we saw an island there that we were some of the first people to see because glaciers had retreated so far that they had revealed an island that no one knew until recently even existed. So the vanishing of the ice from the high Arctic was definitely a piece of that story too. And when we sailed into the place where their ship got frozen into the ice, we were only there a week earlier in August than they had been back in 1596. They had gotten completely frozen in, but today in that harbor in August, there's no ice at all. There's just not any ice there.
Last August, a study by the British Antarctic Survey was published in the scientific journal Nature Climate Change and predicted that summer sea ice floating on the surface of the Arctic Ocean will completely disappear by 2035. Looking back, big changes have already taken place. Last July, almost half of Canada's last fully intact ice shelf, the Milne Ice Shelf in the northernmost part of Canada, collapsed into the sea. This broken piece is larger than the island of Manhattan. In addition to ice loss from warmer temperatures, another leftover presence of human activity is also reaching the Arctic shores.
On the second expedition, I went on a tall ship, so I learned how to haul sails and go up the mast and try to imagine seeing this coastline for the first time. These are the first Europeans. These are the first written record that we have of this place at all. And one of the things that I saw on that exposition, unfortunately, was a lot of trash. There was a lot of trash washed up along the shoreline. A couple times when we would do landings and be out in the interior there, we would see animals that had obviously, like reindeer, had gotten their antlers caught up in the nets and had dragged them inland for miles sometimes before they just collapsed in exhaustion. So I saw that trash impacting the wildlife there in really direct ways.
It is vital to restore and preserve this pristine landscape and the wildlife within it for many reasons. At the rate of current glacial melt, the futures of coastal cities and towns are in limbo due to increased sea level rise. According to researchers, if every glacier and ice cap were to melt, it would result in global sea rise of about 230 feet, wiping out every coastal city on Earth. While the Arctic has changed in many ways since William Barents first sailed there, it's still possible to reverse the damage that's been done.
The toll that we have taken through climate change, through hunting some whale species nearly to extinction in various ways through these last 400 years has been pretty drastic for the Arctic. And while we still have a chance to intervene and save a lot of what's left there, I'd like to encourage people to sort of see the differences between then and now, and to think about what we can do to protect some of the things that Barents was the first to record the existence of.
To find out more about this topic and our guest, Andrea Pitzer, visit viewpointsradio.org. Her new book, Icebound, Shipwrecked at the Edge of the World, is now available online and in bookstores. For more behind the scenes, check out Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
But those small businesses, in the aggregate, are 50% of all jobs and 45% of GDP. It's about half the economy.
One economist's theories on post-pandemic America. then?
It was a life lived much closer to the bone than the more comfortable life that you encounter in the middle class and the suburbs.
Exploring the oil fields of rural North Dakota. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.